Welcome back to the Religious Studies Podcast. Before we get started, just a quick note that this deep dive is AI generated, and every bit of it is fact-checked by our expert, Bastian Freiborg.
That's right.
Now, today we're diving into a topic that some might find a bit, well, intense.
Intense, yeah.
Cannibalism,
Hmm.
but specifically how it connects with religious beliefs.
Yeah, it's fascinating, really, where anthropology, psychology, and religious studies all come together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we're focusing mainly on indigenous tribes in South America.
Right.
Our main source for this deep dive is Cognition, Cannibalism.
Yes.
It looks at two tribes in particular, the Guayaki and the Wari,
Uh-huh.
but we'll also be using other research to get a broader view, and to understand different perspectives.
Yeah, it's really easy to, just label cannibalism as primitive or barbaric.
Right.
But doing that ignores all the nuances. These practices were deeply connected to belief systems
Exactly.
and how different cultures understood death and the afterlife,
Okay, so the Guayaki, according to our main source, they mainly practiced what's called endocannibalism.
That's right.
So that
They
means,
consume the remains of their own people, usually deceased relatives.
wow. And they believe that by doing this?
By doing this, they stopped the souls of the dead, which they called Ianve, from hanging around and possibly causing harm.
It's so different from how we, in lots of Western cultures, view the body after death. Like we
Yeah.
often try to preserve the body,
Yeah. It's a big contrast. The Guayaki, they believed that the soul, or Ianve, was really closely tied to the physical body.
Mm.
Consuming it was a way to make sure the soul could safely move on to the afterlife.
Okay. I'm wondering, do you think this ties into the whole concept of contagion avoidance?
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. From an evolutionary standpoint,
Yeah.
avoiding things that are associated with death and decay, it's a survival strategy. Those things can carry diseases.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the Guayaki cannibalism, while it's, shocking at first, it actually comes from a desire to protect everyone.
Right. Both the living and the deceased.
Exactly.
Right.
It's not about being cruel.
Well,
It's about caring for their community in life and in death.
Yeah, that's it.
Now, the Waris, they also practiced cannibalism. But it was more complex, right?
It was, yeah. They practiced both endo and exocannibalism.
So they consumed their own deceased, like the Guayaki,
Uh-huh.
but they also consumed their enemies.
That's right.
And those motivations were, I imagine, pretty different.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So when it came to their own people, was it still about helping the soul transition and preventing harm?
It was partly about that, yes. But cognition cannibalism, it emphasizes just how emotionally complex their rituals were.
Right.
They believed that by consuming the body of a loved one, it actually helped to ease the grief of the living.
So it's not just about the dead, but also about the living and how they cope.
Exactly. They saw death as a process, not as a full stop.
Hmm.
And by sort of incorporating the deceased into themselves, they kept that connection going, like a sense of continuity.
It's amazing how their whole view of the body and soul is so different from the kind of dualistic views we often see,
It is.
like in Western religions.
Yeah. Now, for the Waris, when they consumed enemies,
Right.
that was totally different. That was about hostility
Uh-huh.
and wanting to show their dominance.
So even within the same culture,
Yeah.
cannibalism could have totally opposite meanings.
Exactly. It's not a simple single thing. And to really grasp this, I think it's helpful to look at the work of Pascal Boyer.
Boyer. Oh, his book, Religion Explained. That was a game changer for me.
Yeah, he offers some really valuable insights into how our minds, how they make sense of religious ideas. And one of his key ideas is intuitive ontologies.
Ontologies. Now that sounds complicated.
Well, think of them like mental frameworks
Okay.
that we use to put things in the world into categories. So we have one for people, one for animals, one for objects, and so on. And these ontologies tell us what to expect from each category.
So like if I see a bird, my bird ontology is telling me it'll probably fly, build a nest, sing.
Right,
and-
exactly. But religion, it often brings in concepts that totally break those expectations. And Boyer calls these counterintuitive concepts.
Like a talking tree.
Uh-huh, exactly. Trees don't talk, but in a myth, that talking tree, it grabs your attention. It sticks with you.
Yeah, it does.
And these counterintuitive concepts, they're often at the heart of religious beliefs, especially beliefs about the supernatural.
So how does this apply to the Wari and their cannibalism?
Well, think about death. It's like
Mhm.
the ultimate counterintuitive event. Our person ontology tells us that people have thoughts and feelings and desires, But then death comes along and, well, it throws a wrench in things.
Yeah, it does. It kind of breaks that framework.
And so religions step in.
Yeah.
They give us explanations. They help us make sense of this thing that doesn't fit our understanding of the world.
Right.
And often those explanations involve spirits or an afterlife or some kind of continued existence.
And those spirits, in many cultures, they could stick around and influence us.
Exactly.
Which brings us back to cannibalism.
Right. It's a way of dealing with these counterintuitive beings, these spirits that don't fit neatly into our categories of alive or dead. Precisely. And the Waris, their beliefs, they really highlight another of Boyer's ideas.
Okay, which one?
Strategic information.
What's that all about?
It's the idea that supernatural beings, they often have access to information that we as ordinary humans don't.
Okay.
Information that's super important for how our society works. They know who's been good or bad, who's gossiping, who's breaking the rules, all that stuff.
That makes sense. So the fact that gods and spirits might know all this,
Yeah,
it explains why we're so careful about their rules, why we try so hard to please them.
exactly. And it helps to explain why the Waris and so many other cultures develop such elaborate rituals around death and the afterlife.
Because death isn't just biological, it's social and spiritual too. It disrupts everything. And these rituals, even cannibalism, are ways to try to fix that disruption.
Absolutely. But what's also fascinating about the Waris is that their beliefs about the afterlife weren't limited to spirits. They believed in reincarnation,
Okay.
specifically involving peccaries,
Peccaries.
a kind of wild pig. They believed that the spirits of the dead could come back as these peccaries.
Wow. So it's not just about the soul going to some spirit world.
No.
It's about a continued presence in the cycle of life and death and rebirth, but in a different form.
Exactly. And this belief, it really impacted their practices, including cannibalism.
So how did eating peccaries fit into all of this? So did they eat peccaries as a way to reconnect with their loved ones? You know, like how they consume the bodies of their relatives?
It's a good question, but the answer's not so straightforward. They did eat peccaries,
Yeah.
but it wasn't seen as directly eating the deceased. It was more about, like, taking part in this give and take between humans and animals.
Reciprocity.
Exactly. So they thought that by eating peccaries, they were honoring the spirits of the dead, the ones that had become these animals. But they also knew they had to give something back.
Keep things balanced.
Right, to keep things in harmony.
Okay, so how did they give back to the peccary spirits? Did they, like, knit them little sweaters or something?
I don't think peccary fashion was a big concern. They offered more symbolic gifts, like food or other things, to keep the spirits happy. They knew that if they took something from nature, they had to give something back.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful idea, recognizing that everything's connected.
It is. And it shows a worldview that's so different from, well, from the human-centered view we often see in the West.
Where humans are separate from and better than nature.
Yeah, the Waris saw themselves as part of this bigger web of life. That included animals and plants and spirits. And everything they did, even their cannibalism, was about maintaining that balance.
But then that harmony was broken, right? When the Europeans showed up.
Unfortunately, yes. As colonialism spread, Europeans tried to wipe out anything they saw as savage. And cannibalism was definitely on that list.
Our source, Cognition, Cannibalism. It really shows that tension between those two worldviews.
It does. The Europeans, coming from a Christian background, they saw cannibalism as, well, an abomination, a sign of being uncivilized.
It's interesting, though, because even in Christianity, there's that symbolic eating of Christ's body and blood in the Eucharist.
Right. But I guess that's different because it's all ritualized and metaphorical.
Yeah.
For the Europeans, the Wari cannibalism, it threatened their whole idea of order, of what it meant to be civilized.
So they tried to civilize them by force if they had to.
Sadly, yes. They used force and persuasion to try and make the Wari ascend their traditions.
So how did the Wari respond to that kind of pressure?
It must have been a tough situation. On the one hand, you've got these powerful outsiders, but then their own beliefs were so deeply rooted in their culture.
A clash of cultures.
Exactly. And in the end, the Waris had to adapt. They stopped practicing cannibalism. But their core beliefs about the afterlife and the connections between humans, animals, and spirits, those seem to have stayed strong.
So they found a way to hold on to their beliefs, even if how they showed them had to change.
That's right. Their story is like proof of how resilient belief can be, even with so much pressure to change.
So what happened to the Waris and their unique way of seeing the world?
Well, Like a lot of indigenous cultures, they went through this process of assimilation, of acculturation.
Yeah.
They had to adapt to the dominant culture. And a lot of times that meant losing their own traditions.
Yeah.
But cognition og cannibalism suggests that pieces of their beliefs and practices survived, passed down through generations, sometimes in hidden ways.
It reminds us that culture isn't static. It's always changing.
It is.
And even when traditions are suppressed, they can leave a lasting impact.
Absolutely. The Wari story might seem far removed from us, but it's still relevant today.
Really? How so?
Well, for one thing, it makes us face the complexities of cultural difference. It challenges us to try and understand beliefs and practices that, well, at first might seem strange to us, or even repulsive.
To go beyond that initial ooh
Yeah.
reaction and really try to see the world through someone else's eyes.
Yes, exactly. And to realize that our own views, they're shaped by our own cultural biases.
Okay, that makes sense.
Hmm.
But for me, what's really powerful about the Waris is their sense of being connected to the natural world.
Yeah, it is a powerful concept. They understood something that in our modern world, well, we seem to have lost sight of.
What's that?
That we're not separate from nature.
Mm,
We're a part of it.
right.
And our actions, they affect this delicate balance, this web of life.
Their story is kind of a reminder, maybe even a warning, about how important it is to respect that balance.
It is. And maybe by trying to understand their beliefs and practices, even the ones that might shock us, we can learn something valuable about our own relationship with nature.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. We've looked at the Guayaki and the Waris. We've explored how we think about religious ideas. And we've talked about the challenges of cultural contact and colonialism. What are the key things you want listeners to take away from this deep dive?
I think the biggest thing for me is that, cannibalism, yeah, it's a taboo in a lot of cultures, but it's not this simple, horrible thing. It can mean so many different things. It can be driven by so many different reasons.
Exactly. Our main source, Cognition og Cannibalism, it stresses that to get cannibalism, we have to look at it through the lens of the culture itself, their beliefs, their practices, the whole picture.
Yeah, and with the Guayaki and the Wari, their cannibalism, it was tied to their ideas about the soul and the afterlife and how humans and nature all connect.
Right, exactly.
It's like a reminder to, to leave our own assumptions behind and to try to understand other cultures.
Yeah, with curiosity, not judgment.
Exactly. And it's not about just being, politically correct.
No, not at all. It's about getting a fuller picture of what it means to be human, in all its different forms.
I agree.
I have to admit, when we started this, I thought cannibalism was something like from the distant past or from really isolated cultures. But talking about it, I've realized that, well, even in modern Western society, we have our own kinds of cannibalism, even if they're metaphorical or symbolic.
That's a great point. And Beth Conklin, the anthropologist who studied the Wari, she's written about how cannibalistic imagery pops up all the time in modern culture.
Like what?
Well, think about some of the phrases we use, like devouring a book.
Yeah.
Or consuming information.
Oh, right. Or being swallowed up by a corporation.
Exactly. We're using cannibalistic language to talk about absorbing things or dominating things.
Oh, it's true. We don't even realize we're doing it.
Right. It just shows how much these ideas are embedded in us, in our subconscious. Cannibalism, even in its metaphorical forms, it gets at those really primal fears and desires, about power, control, and the lines between ourselves and others.
And it's not just language either. There's cannibalism in art and books and movies.
Oh, yeah. Tons of examples from like Goya's painting Saturn devouring his son.
Right.
To all those recent horror movies that play on our fascination with cannibalism. And our disgust. It's a theme that keeps coming back, keeps drawing us in.
So maybe by looking at all these different kinds of cannibalism, the literal and the symbolic, we can learn something about ourselves, about our own fears and what we long for.
That's a really interesting thought. And maybe it can also help us be more understanding of other cultures and their practices, with more nuance and compassion.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up. So to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of cannibalism. It's a complex world and often a disturbing one, but we hope this deep dive has given you something to think about, maybe challenged some assumptions, and broadened your understanding.
And like always, keep exploring, keep learning.